Okay, so the last credit transactions I will discuss will be guarantee, surety, and antichresis. With these discussions, again, I will focus na lang yun on the most important provisions as anyway, I'm not saying that they're not very common in our day-to-day lives or in our day-to-day transactions, but rather because they are very self-explanatory. So to save time, and because you have also already read about this, so I will just focus on the most important provisions. Okay, so what is a guarantee, guys? Is defined in Article 2047. By a guarantee, a person called a guarantor binds himself to the creditor to fulfill the obligation of the principal debtor in case the latter should fail to do so. So it is a contract between the guarantor and the creditor. So if I have here my scenario, so the debtor owes the creditor, diba? But as a security, instead of giving a property to secure the obligation, but what is given here is the promise by the third person to the guarantor, promising to the creditor that he will pay in case the debtor cannot pay or fails to pay or does not pay the obligation to the creditor. So the contract of guarantee is really between the guarantor and the creditor. And if you recall in your obligations and contracts, when the guarantor pays, it has to, when the third person pays, like the guarantor, the third person, the guarantor, must be interested in the fulfillment of the obligation. Otherwise, the creditor cannot be compelled to accept the payment by a third person because the payment or performance to be valid must be done by the debtor himself. So what are the characteristics of the contract? Again, it is accessory or subsidiary because it is dependent for the existence upon a principal obligation, the debtor's obligation towards the creditor. It is subsidiary and conditional because the guarantor will only be liable if the debtor cannot pay or does not pay. It is unilateral because it only gives rise to an obligation on the part of the guarantor. Okay? Now, the guarantee, guys, is essentially or generally gratuitous. There is no consideration. There is no recompense available to the guarantor because anyway, the guarantor, by virtue of the subrogatory rights, becomes the new creditor and acquires the rights available to the creditor as against the debtor. So the guarantee is gratuitous and it can be undertaken without the consent or with the consent of the debtor. But the effects lang after payment of the guarantor, you have to take note, if it is without the consent of the debtor, the guarantor is only allowed beneficial reimbursement. But if it is with the consent of the debtor, he is allowed full reimbursement and subrogatory rights. So katong rules na to sa payment by third person, they are applicable here. Okay? In guarantee, the guarantor may secure existing obligations or future obligations. So it doesn't matter existing or future. But what is important, at the time of payment by the guarantor, the amount of the obligation is already liquidated or already fixed because the guarantor's liability or obligation cannot exceed the principal obligation. So dili pwede mas dako pa siya bayaran sa kung pila gyoy utang because that's already, he's only securing the principal obligation ba yan, okay? Now you take note, guys, the qualifications of the guarantor. He possesses integrity, has the capacity to bind himself, and he has sufficient property. And because the obligation of the guarantor is only secondary and subsidiary and conditional, you have to take note of Article 2058, katong benefit of exclusion or exhaustion. Now, only after the creditor has exhausted the properties of the debtor will the guarantor be liable. Now, if for the guarantor to avail of that benefit of exclusion or exhaustion, kung mapaninglan gani siya ni creditor, kailangan iyang tabangan si creditor og locate og properties nga magamit, properties ni debtor nga magamit pambayad sa utang. And then after that, kung wala na gyud makuha, ma-exhaust, that's the time that the guarantor will pay to the creditor. Okay, now, the exceptions to the benefit of exclusion as provided for in 2059, if the guarantor has expressly renounced it because there is a waiver, if he has bound himself solidarily with the debtor, so this is already a different story because this is like surety already, or in case of insolvency of the debtor and the guarantor guarantees the solvency of the principal debtor. Okay? Then you have 2066, the indemnification and subrogation in 2067. So after paying the creditor, the guarantor acquires all the rights of the creditor and he will use that as against the debtor for purposes of demanding for the payment for reimbursement. Okay? How about surety, guys? So the difference between a guarantee and a surety is solidarily liable. So he is like the debtor good. So once the obligation becomes due and demandable, the surety is also liable already. Not like the guarantor na only when the debtor does not pay or cannot pay will he be liable. So surety, the moment that the debtor is liable, he is also liable automatically. Okay? Because of the solidary liability. And then lastly is antichresis. So let's have antichresis. A contract whereby the creditor acquires the right to receive the fruits of the immovable property belonging to the debtor with the obligation to apply the fruits to the payment of the interest if owing, then to the principal amount. So what is peculiar or what is a unique in a contract of antichresis is that the creditor acquires the fruits and will use the fruits in payment of the obligation. Using the rules on payment nga i-apply sa interest usa and then to the principal amount already. Okay, so there is management that the anti-credit creditor will acquire the management over the property for him to be able to get the fruits from the property and apply those fruits to the payment of the obligation. Okay, so that's it. Those are the different kinds of credit transactions.